One of the most rewarding things you can do as a DM is to present your players with an awesome puzzle that'll have them scratching their heads and getting that really awesome feeling of actually solving something and getting to move on. But making great puzzles is also one of the hardest things you can do as a DM. So if you're looking for a way to make great puzzles for your 5e D&D game or any role-playing game in general, this is the video for you. So what I want to do in this video is give you step-by-step directions to how I come up with great puzzles, and I'll also be using an example puzzle as we go along to sort of illustrate what it is that I'm doing and how it can be taken from theory to actual practice. There's another reason I like this topic, and it's because I'm actually in the process of making a lot of puzzles for our newest book, Milando's Guide to Magical Marvels, which is live on Kickstarter right now, or if you're watching this video in the future, maybe for sale. In either case, there should be a link down in the description where you can pledge for the book or get it if it is already out there. So there are three major steps that I take when making a puzzle, and those are figuring out the purpose, and then deciding on the premise, and then thinking about the process. So we got purpose, premise, and process. The purpose is why is the puzzle here and who is it for. Premise is about figuring out what the puzzle actually is and how it is solved. And then there's the process where we go in and refine how the characters can actually solve the puzzle, which hints should we give, and are there any consequences of failure. Diving into the first step, you want to figure out the purpose. At its core, a puzzle is like a lock, except that it doesn't open with a specific key that some person can physically hold. Instead, it opens to anyone who can figure out how to solve it. When you're using a puzzle instead of a lock, you're also sort of saying that the person or people who created the puzzle want someone specific or someone who meets a specific criteria to be able to bypass it, because why else give hints to how to solve it? So the first thing we need to do here is think about where is the puzzle and why is there a puzzle here. Puzzles are most commonly found in a wizard's tower or a mad scientist dungeon and other places like that. The common theme here being that it's a place where we have something that someone wants to keep hidden or away from others, except for a specific group of people who have certain skills, abilities, or knowledge. So for the example I'll be providing, I'll be using a sorcerer's chest, which could be found in this sorcerer's crypt, and the sorcerer is of course interested in keeping everyone except a certain group of people out of the chest and keep their treasures for only those that they would think are worthy. And that of course leads us to the next question, which is who is the puzzle for? If you have a puzzle in an elven crypt, it would be something that only elves or true followers of Corellon, the elven deity, would be able to figure out, while a puzzle in a wizard's college perhaps would be there as a test for pupils to see if they have the necessary arcane knowledge and lore to be able to figure it out. In our example with the sorcerer's chest, we'll say that the sorcerer is an elemental sorcerer, or was an elemental sorcerer before they died. So the puzzle is all about knowing the elements and having that lore, that knowledge, and maybe also the abilities to produce these elements, because that is the features that a person, the sorcerer, would find worthy would have. Moving on to the next step, we have the puzzle's premise. This is the meat and potatoes of the puzzle, where we actually figure out what it is and what the characters must do to solve it. When we know why the puzzle is there and who is it for, we can start thinking about the puzzle's theme or themes. That means thinking about what sort of themes, words comes to mind when you think about the sort of environment the puzzle would be in and who is meant to be able to solve it. I can give you some examples here. So if you have a puzzle in a wizard's tower that is meant for practitioners of the arcane arts, that could be arcane lore or the ability to cast spells or knowledge about something in the planes and stuff like that. If you have a puzzle in an elven crypt, maybe the themes would be nature, the seasons, a long life, or love, any of the stuff you would probably associate with elves. In our concrete case with the sorcerer's chest, the theme would be elemental and magic, because that is what the sorcerer was all about and what it wants to test the characters or anyone who tries to get past the puzzle, see if they know about the elements as well. Once you have a theme or set of themes that you think would be appropriate for its puzzle, you may have already gotten an idea about what the puzzle should be. But if you haven't, or the idea needs to be developed a bit, I find that I usually go to the puzzle masters and the DM's greatest tools, the tried and true boring and stealing. because boring and stealing is the bread and butter of being a good DM. So what I would usually do is that I would take my theme or the buzzwords associated with it, and I would go onto a computer simply, and I'll start typing in riddle or puzzle plus the word that I'm looking for. Usually just doing that will wield a lot of different riddles, puzzles. Maybe there's a DM on some forum sometime who actually posed the same question or had the same idea for a puzzle or had an idea that you can borrow or twist or adapt to your purposes. And there's also just pages and pages of good riddles on the internet that you can sort of splice together or just find one that really suits your needs. So in our example, we are looking for a puzzle that has to do with elements, and typing in elements plus riddle may not yield the results we're looking for, so we can start typing in earth riddle or fire riddle, water riddle, and so on. And lo and behold, we actually get something we can use and maybe adapt to create a really good puzzle. Now this is of course just the initial spark of inspiration, the start of the premise of the puzzle. What we need to do next is actually develop and create the puzzle around our theme, around our buzzwords, and maybe around a riddle or a sort of premise we've borrowed from elsewhere. And when it's time to do that, I usually try to decide upon which type of puzzle I would like. Knowing the different types of puzzle is very beneficial, and also of course knowing when to use which type. So in general, I'll say that there are 3 types of puzzle you usually run into in D&D games, and the first would be a simple riddle. That's just having a riddle written on the door or on a lock or something like that, and then giving the answer or making a certain action based on the answer or based on the riddle will let the characters go through.
It reads, "The doors of Durin, Lord of Moria. Speak, friend, and enter."
We can also make a more complex puzzle, and that usually means putting multiple riddles together or multiple steps in a riddle where the characters not only have to just find an answer, they may also have to take an action based on that answer, or they may have to take and answer several riddles that together form the answer that will get them through whatever puzzle it is that they are working with. Then there's a third kind of puzzle, and those are the logical or word puzzles, where the characters and the players basically have to figure out how to arrange some letters to form a specific word, or maybe they have a mathematical problem of sorts that they'll need to figure out, or maybe they're just not given a riddle in itself but have to figure stuff out by figuring out, okay, we move that statue, this happens, so we have to move these 2 statues at the same time, and then that'll happen, and so on. So this is sort of different type of puzzle. You'll often see them in D&D books with whole pages of letters and numbers that have to be rearranged. This sort of puzzle can be fun, but it usually takes a long time to make and also a long time to play through, and may not always be as fun as you think they are. If made well, they can be very great though. So in the example that I'm giving, I could just go with a simple riddle. That'll just be the fire riddle. I'll have that on the screen somewhere here. The answer is fire. They say that, boom, the lock pops open. We can make it more complex by saying they have to actually take fire and burn the lock, so that makes it open. But we can also, and that's what I'm leaning towards, of course, make it a completely elemental chest that has 4 different locks and a riddle for each that says, of course, air, earth, fire, and water, and they have to take a step for each as well. So they have to blow air into the airlock, they have to put some dirt or soil into the earth lock, they have to burn the fire lock, and they have to put water into the water lock. And once all 4 locks are opened, then the chest will pop open. If we were using a logical or word puzzle, we could have the whole floor covered in tiles that spell out different letters, and only by taking the path that spells out air, earth, fire, and water, which of course will make for a janky path across the floor, can the characters avoid stepping on the trapped tiles. So that's also a way we could use that instead. Now you may think that once you've decided on a premise and you've found a riddle or a concept that you think works and developed it a bit, then you're practically done. And in some cases you probably are, but I do find that it really pays off to think a bit about the puzzle's process. So that's what we'll be taking a look at next. The first thing I usually do is to really try and evaluate how difficult the puzzle is versus how difficult I want it to be. Because in some situations you have a puzzle that the characters absolutely need to figure out because they die if they don't, or they can't continue on the adventure if they don't. And in those cases you really don't want a puzzle that is too hard. You may even need to ask your partner or your family or your friends, just try and post them this puzzle and see if they can figure it out, because if they have a really hard time with it, chances are your players will too. Obviously, if you have a puzzle that the characters don't need to solve, it's just a nice to have thing, they can get a shortcut or a magical item they'll otherwise miss, then they don't need to solve the puzzle and you don't need to make it actually easy enough to be certain that it'll be solved. So if you find that the puzzle is maybe a bit too hard, it can pay off to put in some additional hints for how the puzzle can be solved. This means going in and giving some hints that the players can use if they're stalling on it, if they simply can't figure it out. Leaving some hints around the room or the environment that they're in will really help ensure that it doesn't just end up being a frustrating experience. Now, these hints should be subtle. It shouldn't be something that you're throwing in the players' faces, because you still want them to get that sense of it's actually them figuring out the puzzle. It's not just you handing them the answers. So in our example, we could have some glyphs of the elemental languages written on the logs or around them. So there would be Auran glyphs on the air log, there would be Ignan glyphs on the fire log, Terran glyphs on the earth log, and Aquan glyphs on the water log. These are the elemental languages associated with each element. And we can just say to the characters as they come in, there are some glyphs scribbled on the logs without elaborating further. And then it's only when they decide to investigate them that they may figure out what sort of languages they are and what that signifies. You should always remember that if you want the characters to have the hint, you shouldn't gate it behind a skill check. It's okay to say the wizard can recognize the languages as long as they're proficient in Arcana, though they may not be able to read what they actually say. Although you don't want to push the hints in the players' faces, you may need to just give them a bit of a shove in the right direction if they're stalling. So you could say after a while, if the characters are really stumped, wizard, you notice that there are some glyphs scribbled on the log. Then there is, of course, the other side of the coin, which is consequences. Consequences are not always necessary. Sometimes just wasting time figuring out the puzzle is a consequence in itself. If the chamber is filling up with water and they are going to drown if they don't figure out the puzzle, well, then that is a huge consequence. And if they are being chased by demons and they need to get quickly through this door before the demons catch up, then wasting 2 minutes figuring out a puzzle is also, of course, a consequence. Sometimes you do want to have consequences that happen when the characters are trying to figure out the puzzle, and that is, of course, to prevent them from just brute forcing it. That's especially prevalent in logic or word puzzles where there are only a fixed amount of solutions or a fixed number of solutions, and the characters can just keep on trying, and that just makes it really boring and something that takes a long while if there's not these consequences to sort of tell them you need to try and figure out the right word, not just try anything that goes. So in our case, with the 4 logs, we could have a consequence each time the characters attempt to open a lock in the wrong way, if they put the wrong substance into the wrong keyhole, or if they try and force it open or pick it open with a lockpick, we could have something happen. We of course want these consequences to be thematically fitting, so that could be fire coming out of the fire keyhole, or a character's lungs filling with water if they try to force the water keyhole or the water lock, or air blowing the character into the ceiling if they try to force the airlock, and a minor earthquake pushing everyone to the ground and dealing some damage if they try to force the earth lock. It's also very important to note that these consequences should probably be minor, so we don't want to really almost kill the characters every time they fail solving the puzzle, and you should be especially wary about making consequences that are time sensitive and will perhaps or could perhaps kill the characters if they're not fast enough, because that puts the players under a lot of stress, and simply dying because you drown in a room because you weren't fast enough to figure out a logical puzzle, that's something that can happen in a official adventure actually, then that's just not very fun. And that sort of leads into the last point here, which is implementing a failsafe. Because sometimes, no matter how many hints you give it, the players or the characters simply can't figure the puzzle out. And that's why I think it's hugely beneficial to think about having a failsafe, because if you don't, you may need to just step in there, give them the solution, roll an intelligence check, and they get 11. Oh yeah, you figured out. And that's not very fun. What you want to do is you want to have thought about something that can happen that will give them an additional hint in the right direction, or maybe even make the puzzle easy to solve. So if you have a trapped puzzle floor in a dungeon, you could have a rat scurry across the room after a few minutes or half an hour out of game time if the players are simply confused about it. And by seeing the rat's movements, they can sort of figure out, okay, these types of tiles don't have a trap and these types of tiles have, and maybe that solves the puzzle entirely, or maybe it just gives them a huge push towards figuring out the correct solution. In our example with the sorcerer's chest, we could have a familiar of the sorcerer that has survived it. Perhaps it's a spiral familiar, pop out and say, oh, I hope you're not going to begin kissing that lock or something for the airlock. You could also have the sorcerer's ghost pop out, and if they can test it in battle, they fight with it, and the sorcerer sees that they're capable and they know enough, then they will let them access the chest even if they fail to figure out the puzzle. Granted, these are not optimal outcomes for the puzzle, but they are vastly preferable to the alternative, which is in most cases death or stalling the adventure or just having a bad and frustrating experience. So that's my process for creating D&D 5e puzzles, or any puzzles in general. You want to figure out the puzzle's purpose. Why is it there? Why is that not just a lock? Why is there a need for a puzzle? And also figure out who is it for? Who is meant to be able to solve this puzzle? Why do we leave hints here? Which sort of people and which sort of knowledge and skills are we trying to test? Then there's figuring out the premise, where we go in and we try to decide the puzzle's theme or themes. Then we take these themes to give us inspiration, search on the internet, or think about popular culture, references, anything, borrow and steal until we find a riddle or find a premise, find a setup, a scenario that we think is awesome, and then we build upon it, flesh it out, and make it into an actual D&D puzzle. And then there is the process, where we go in and take a look at how the puzzle is solved, think about what sort of hints we want to give the characters if they're stalling a bit, if they can't figure it out, and how also which kind of consequences we could put in there to make it more fun, ensure that it doesn't just become a long trial and error process. And lastly, there are of course the fail-safes, where we think about how we can let the characters bypass the puzzle in a just a bit more fun way than not being able to solve it at all. I've actually created a small document for the elemental chest where I've written out the puzzle's purpose, premise, and also process, so you can see how I would go about creating this puzzle for a party of players. And if you want more cool puzzles, arcane content, adventures, monsters, magic items, merchants that sell magical services including rune enchanting and spell warping and spell marks and all kinds of cool stuff, then I would love for you to check out Milando's Guide to Magical Marvels, which you can find a link to in the description down below, and which is live on Kickstarter right now, or in our web shop somewhere if you're watching this from the future. So yeah, that's the video for today. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked it, you can leave a comment, a like, subscribe, tell me about some of your best puzzles or what sort of processes you go through when you're trying to figure out a puzzle. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot left to say, except thank you for watching, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.